And you can see here the body now has this little tag next to it that says grid. And I'm going to click on that. And that's going to show us the grid visually here in the main window. And you can see it's added lines around each area. It's added this shading over the gutters. With CSS grids. I know the spec can be daunting, there's a lot that it can do, but we can start to do some fairly interesting layouts with just very little code. So I'm going to start here by just adding display grid. to the body. And you can see that nothing really changes here. The default grid is very much like the default block flow. We can put it in there pretty safely without expecting much to happen. Now, one of the cool things about grid is that we can add gutters in a more consistent way. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to add, it's called grid gap of 1m, and all of my block elements will jump apart by that much. So the grid gap goes between each of the grid areas. I'm going to inspect this in Firefox Nightly here. And I've opened the grid inspector here in Firefox. And you can see here the body now has this little tag next to it that says grid. And I'm going to click click on that, and that's going to show us the grid visually here in the main window. And you can see it's added lines around each area. It's added this shading over the gutters. And we have these line numbers. So the first line is 1, and then the second line is 2, 3, 4, 5. So we've automatically got 5 grid row lines down the page, and just 1 and 2 across. They're also negative 1 indexed going backwards. So that's just happening automatically. I'm going to turn that off quick. So what we have there is the implicit grid that's generated automatically when we create a grid and we haven't defined it yet. What I'm going to do now is add some grid template rows. So rows go down the page, and I'm just going to give some sizing to these things. I'm going to say that the first one is auto-sized, that's the header, and then the nav is also going to be auto-sized, and then the main content is going to be 1 fraction, which means it can take up as much space as it needs to in the layout, however much space is remaining. And then the footer, again, I'm going to set to auto. Now that didn't change anything yet, because there's no extra space there for the main area to take up. So I'm just going to add some extra space with a min height of 100 VH, that's viewport height. So it's going to be at least the height of the viewport. And you can see that because of the rows, if I didn't have grid template rows there, they would all expand in a similar way. But by adding the grid template rows, I've made it so that now the main area takes up more space and the others stay the same size. So this might work for us as a mobile layout, and we might not even worry about the grid fallback for mobile because it's fairly similar. There's not really much happening here yet. I'm going to try to create then inside of this media query, so for any page over 40 ems wide, we're going to add a little bit more complex layout. Again, we're going to use grid template columns, but we're going to set up a sidebar that's 12 ems and then a main space that's 1 fraction that takes up all of the remaining space available in the window. And you can see that everything sort of falls into place there automatically. The first column stays 12 ems, and the second column takes up whatever space is left. And that's pretty cool because that means that we can start doing layouts that really mix fixed units with fluid units in a more reliable way, which is really nice thing about grid. And then I'm going to say we actually want 3 rows. So right now it's giving us 2 by default. We want 3 rows. The first one's going to be auto size. The second one's going to be as much space as we need, and then the footer will go along the bottom. So if I define those 3 rows, auto, 1 fraction, auto. Right now, we're not seeing that last row. It's collapsing because there's nothing in it. And what I'm going to do is tell the header to span 2 columns. I added grid column span 2 to the header, and that made it take up the entire top space. Instead of making the footer go the whole way across, I'm going to make the nav go the whole way down that side. So I'm going to add nav grid row span 2. And it will go down that whole side, and then main and footer are both being pushed into place. I don't have to be more explicit here if I don't want to be. I could if it's useful for some reason, but you can see here now we have a mobile view on small screens, and when I make the screen bigger, it jumps to this layout. I can also change the height of the window. And you can see again that main and nav are stretching as much as they need to take up the space, while the header and footer always remain the same size. And it's this sort of sticky footer where if the window gets big, the footer is still there, but if the window is smaller, we're able to scroll. Once we have these named areas, the only thing that we have to do then to make our header and navigation span the multiple columns and rows is assign them a grid area. So we say header grid area banner, nav grid area nav, main grid area main, etc. And by giving them these names, we can just change in one place what the layout that we want is going to look like, and then that will change for anything assigned to that area. You can see there I changed banner to just span 1. I could make nav come up here into the header, and it will take over that space. And that means that the parent element, in this case the body, can sort of control the layout from one place. So we can set up multiple layouts at different screen sizes or in different contexts, and everything else will fall into place. Another thing that we can do with grid that is really helpful for getting started is use this grid template areas. It's a way of using sort of ASCII art to define a layout. So I've defined our mobile layout here by just giving names to the 4 different areas we have in mobile. And let's just see them there. We have a banner, nav, main, and footer. And then I can add a media query. All I have to do at a media query is change the structure of those areas. So now I've made banner go across 2 columns, and then nav in a single column, and then main side by side, and then nav and footer also side by side. So you can see here the banner is going to go across the top, the nav is going to come down the side, and then main and footer are going to fill in the gaps. And when we extend our window, that's what we see happen. And I think that's just a great way to get started with Grid. That's really sort of the terms and pieces of code that you need to get started. And you can see that some of the fallbacks are going to happen in some ways automatically. If you turn off Grid, you'll automatically get the mobile layout that you started with, and you can build on top of that. Have fun and get started with Grid. Anything assigned to that area. You can see there I changed banner to just span 1. I could make nav come up here into the header and it will take over that space. And that means that the parent element, in this case the body, can sort of control the layout from one place. So we can set up multiple layouts at different screen sizes or in different contexts, and everything else will fall into place. Another thing that we can do with Grid that is really helpful for getting started is use this Grid template areas. It's a way of using sort of ASCII art to
Grid makes it simple to create columns, so let's apply this to our work experience section to align the job details. Grid makes it simple to create columns, so let's apply this to our work experience section to align the job detail blocks into 2 columns per job listing. Here's how it looks in the final project example. Let's go to our text editor and look at the HTML structure. All the job items are currently contained within the work experience area. Right now, the content wrap div contains all of the job items. Each job item is contained within a section tag. This can be the grid container. We also want 2 columns within the job items, so we'll split the content into 2 separate boxes. So let's start by adding a class to the section element. I'm going to call it job item. Then we'll use divs to split the content into 2 boxes. I'm going to add the job title, company name, and date into one box and call it job details. So I'll cut these 3 items and paste them in between the div tags. The rest of the content can go into a second box. I'm going to call this one job summary. Job-summary. And I'll move the rest of this content into this second box. We should also add these updates to the other job items as well. So I'll add the class into my second job item and also create the 2 columns. And finally, the last job item. Two columns here as well. Div, job details, and one more column. Job summary. Let's save that file. Now that the HTML structure is set up, let's define the grid container. Switch over to our CSS file, and we'll create a new declaration block. Let's go down to the work experience area and add our new job item class. This is going to be our grid container, so here is where we will set the display to grid. We want to create 2 columns, so let's use the grid template columns property with 2 values. I'm going to set mine to 1FR and 2FR. I'm using FR so these columns can be flexible. And I'm using 1FR for the first column because I want it to be smaller than the second column. So this means that my second column is going to be twice the size of the first one. So let's save this file and check the updates in the browser. I'll go back to my current project and refresh the page, and there are my two columns. Right now, my content just happens to line up with a little bit of space in between the columns. But if I had some more characters in any of these text blocks, it'll run right up to the edge of the second column. We should add a gutter to ensure that there will always be a space between the two columns. Before we add the column gap property, I'm going to open up Firefox's developer tools. You can inspect the grid properties with other browsers, but Firefox has a grid inspector tool that includes some useful visualizations. Let's take a look. In the left HTML panel, next to the section tag where we added the job item class, we can see that it's been marked with the grid label. Click on it to see the corresponding CSS. In the other browser tools, you'll be able to see the CSS applied to these elements, just like in this middle panel here. But if we click on this grid icon, it will toggle the grid highlighter. Click on it again to remove the highlighter. You can also select it from this third panel to see the visualization of the grid. Right now, I have 3 grids. If I check them all, then I'll see the visualizations for all 3 of them. Let me just resize the tool a bit so that we could see a bit more of the visualization in the browser. There are also additional grid display settings. If I select Display Line Numbers, then I'll see the line numbers of my grid. There's also another option to display grid area names, but we haven't specified any, so we won't see anything here. And then the third option just extends the lines of the visualization. We can also update the CSS right in the tool. This is super handy for testing. The Grid Inspector is only available in Firefox, but the ability to edit CSS in the Dev tool is available in other browsers. For example, you may want to experiment with the column sizes. You can test out different values here to see how it'll look without actually changing your CSS file. Let's try changing it to 2FR and 3FR instead. Let me just uncheck these display settings for a second so that we could see the changes a little bit more clearly. So just note, whatever you put into these dev tools, it doesn't actually save these changes to your files. So if you refresh the browser, it will reset back to your current CSS settings. We can also add CSS properties here. So let's try adding the column gap property so we can test out some values and also see it in the visualization. Just click into the box and type in the property name. In this case, it's column-gap. And then press Tab once to add the value. Let's try 20 pixels. Now we can see our gutter space. I don't mind using a fixed unit for the gutter space because I don't necessarily need this to be relative to its container. I always want there to be 20 pixels of space between the columns. So let's close the tool to see how the page looks without the lines. Don't forget to actually add this style into your CSS file. Whatever we add in the tool here gets reset once the browser is refreshed. Let's go back to our CSS file and add that in now. Column-gap, 20 pixels. And save the file. Let's go back to the browser and check for those changes. You may have noticed that my column widths just jumped a little bit. That's because we were experimenting with the FR values in the DevTools, but I've just refreshed my page. So now it's going back to the 1FR and 2FR that I set in my CSS file. We could have created this whole page layout using Flexbox or Grid, but it's also common to combine these different layout methods in one page. I know I've probably said this several times already, but there are often many ways to do the same thing. And while there are best practices, every project is a little bit different. It takes time, experience, practice, and often some rewriting to figure out what works best for the particular problem you're trying to solve at that time. This is all part of the process.